When I was a freshman in college, I was looking to escape other 18 to 22-year-olds' totally normal pro-social behavior. I wanted to be reminded of a world outside my Loyola dorm shenanigans. So I found Bethany's website and decided to give it a try. I walked in and I heard Sondheim sung side by side with the hymnals. I stayed for coffee hour and got invited to chat by a couple of 80-year-olds who wanted to hear my story. I experienced a community passionate about welcoming others. And every week, I looked forward to missing that sixth bus that I still think doesn't exist and having to run to the red line stop to make it here. I was willing to brave any CTA troubles to make it to my oasis, Bethany. I went to this church to be renewed and restored as a guest. That was it. Bethany was a sanctuary for me. Sanctuaries, our theme, they provide us a space to land, to find a glimpse of new life. Sanctuaries host guests seeking peace and safety. Last week, in between all of the Easter fun, we put new soil in our garden beds out front. We're hoping to make our yard possibly a pollinator sanctuary, pollinator garden for butterflies, so they can rest as they navigate our windy city. To be honest, this room, which we call a sanctuary, it does the same thing for people that a pollinator garden does for butterflies. It's a space for us to rest and recharge as we go back into being blown around by all the hassles of this windy city. And sadly, just like the butterfly population in the US, often the number of people in progressive churches continues to diminish. So much has been said in my graduate program, online, wherever you look, about the problems in both the decrease of butterflies and the decline of church attendance. So often we talk, what went wrong? And that devolves from a search for solutions to a search for blame. What went wrong so quickly becomes who messed up. And to be honest, I got into ministry because I was angry at other Christians. But focusing on spite as the foundation of my ministry, it made me distrustful, resentful, and just tired. So if the question isn't what went wrong, maybe it's what can we create? So what does it mean to create sanctuary? In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer, she was a Potawatomi botanist, talks about how the Potawatomi language refers to places as verbs. She says English has a limited grammar of animism, a limited ability to capture the aliveness of the God still speaking all around us. And this is partly because for us, if a noun isn't like a human being, it becomes an it. It becomes an object. And against this objectification, she draws careful attention to how in the Potawatomi language, the word bay is the verb to be a bay. I'm not talking about the slang bay, like the person who might be sitting next to you, but bay as in a broad inlet of the sea where the land curves inward. Referring to a bay as a verb instead of a noun doesn't mean that it has emotions or feelings in the same way that we do, but it means it has a life unique to it. If I asked you to picture a bay, the sound and smell of the water gently swaying over the rocks, the sun throwing glare into your eyes at sunset, I bet you can close your eyes and breathe the scene in. And the experience of bay is so different than the experience of a mountain or a desert. It's a different life. And just as a bay is a place alive with the movement of water and sun, our room here, our sanctuary, becomes alive with the Spirit of God when we gather together, eat donuts, praise God, and pray with and for each other in a cycle of hosting and being a guest. This room ceases to be just a sanctuary, the noun, and instead becomes a locus for a living God being sanctuary. But sanctuaries don't just happen. They don't just pop up. A sanctuary needs hosts and it needs guests. In that pollinator garden I was talking about, a lot of work happens under the surface for a flower to blossom and welcome that butterfly. First, the seeds we plant, they have to germinate and become a seedling. Then those seedlings have to gain enough nutrients to grow more vegetation, and finally the plant has to exert so much energy to make like a coneflower. That coneflower puts in a lot of work as a host to host that butterfly. But it's also important to recognize the butterfly's role as guest. That when butterflies move from one garden, like our garden beds, to another garden, they bring with them all the pollen that can diversify the gene pool, which makes each garden stronger the next time they grow. And this leads to stronger plants and new life in each place. The guests brings experience and knowledge, which enriches the host's sanctuary. And if each of us works to be a guest and a host in so many different places, we can create a whole network, an ecology of sanctuary, where we can fly from one garden to the next while tending our own plot to be fit for guests. The flower's work of hosting and the butterfly's work as guests creates the cycle beneficial to both plants and butterflies, which makes the sanctuary alive. It's that motion of guest and host that makes the place a verb instead of a noun. A sanctuary for people becomes an embodiment of the living God because of that same feedback loop of hosting and guesting. The living church of host and guest is what we read about in Acts today, Vince's favorite passage of the Bible. Acts, which continues from the Gospel of Luke, presents a picture of Christians so committed to hosting each other that they erase material needs. Their needs are met by the others around them so quickly, they don't experience lack. And the community is not only willing to be hosts, but also willing to be guests. They're willing to say, this is what I need. I need to take a step back this week. Can you host this week? And all of those questions lead to the early church in Acts, which is a community so intentional about hosting and being guests that the sanctuary is contagious. Every week, people want to get in on that action. They want to see what the sanctuary is all about. And God is revealed among them. Now, this idea of a sanctuary hosting and becoming alive with God's presence is not new. In fact, it goes all the way back to Exodus. In Exodus 40, the conclusion of the Passover narrative, it ends with God's presence filling the sanctuary that the Israelites build in the desert. God turns the sanctuary they construct from a noun into a verb. It is no longer just a sanctuary, it is being sanctuary. And this belief that God was present in space is the reason why the temple was built, and that holiness was attached to it, because that was a living place, a living host. And the authors of so many texts in our scriptures seek to ask the question, how do we help usher God into a space as hosts? And reflecting on the Easter story, I also want to know, how did God usher themselves into our space as host and guest in Jesus? In the Passion narrative that we read about last Thursday, the last few hours of Jesus' life, it's the threat to destroy the temple that gets Jesus arrested for blasphemy. And that claim that he could destroy the temple and rebuild it was heresy, because the temple was the place of sanctuary in Israel, the place where God's Spirit dwelled and all could seek refuge from oppression and fear. And Jesus cared deeply about the temple. Otherwise, he wouldn't have driven people out with whips. But he also teaches us that the temple isn't the only place where God lives, that we get to invite and embody God in every space. We get to create the sanctuary as we go about being hosts and being guests. Our reading from Acts 2, I jumped the liturgical calendar just a little bit for those who care, which I don't think is probably many of us. But it's a response to Pentecost, when God's Spirit settles on each person and sets them aflame. And this new dwelling of God's life in us expanded the bounds of where God existed from the temple into our own hearts and our own rooms, our own homes. And in this, we see God's invitation to us that we get to be the place that turns places from nouns into verbs. We get to be a part of creating spaces that breathe life into others. Our experience of hosting here and being guests here also turns this space from being just a sanctuary into a place that is being sanctuary. I believe that Bethany is a place where God lives right here and right now. And for me, going back to my story at the beginning, Bethany was a space that reminded me to see Christ everywhere, connected me with that Easter vision. But Bethany didn't just become that Sondheim-loving, intergenerational community from nothing. You know, a pollinator garden has to be grown, and the coneflowers have to work hard to create that space that butterflies effortlessly enjoy. In the same way, while I was a guest here, renewing my spirit, there was so much life happening just beneath the surface. The first photo I have for my attendance at Bethany is from February of 2019, and that's the picture you see on your bulletins. You know, I just took a picture of the signage outside because I thought it was cool. Sent it to my family and said, whoa, check this out. But at the same time I was visiting in February, if we jump to March of 2019, Council was negotiating our contract with Montessori. Montessori uses our building Monday through Friday, and their income and that revenue provides much of the work that we can do today. Whether it's, sew-ins, buying pizza for that, whether it's Refugee One, that work comes from that Montessori contract. Now, Ryan was the president of the council at that time, and I read his meeting notes. He was working hard to get that contract signed. But although Ryan and Melissa were hosting me when I was a guest, they too were guests here at one point. Ryan and Melissa first found Bethany when they were looking for a place to get married, and they really liked Pastor Bill Bordenaro. Now, Pastor Bill sadly passed away this last year, but he worked hard to make Bethany an open and affirming congregation, which is why when I first came in, I was so captivated by that picture. That goes back to Reverend Bill. And Pastor Bill was also a guest here, though. He wasn't always a host. Back in May 4th, 2003, there was a search committee that welcomed Pastor Bill with a special service led by Bethany members. They had a vote to usher him in, and then they organized a potluck right after. Now, that search committee in 2003 was able to welcome a new pastor because of the hard work of Bethany members in 1988 to adopt a constitution that laid out the pastoral search process. And that 1988 Constitution was a rewriting of a 1971 Constitution, which goes back to the very beginnings of Bethany, which started on August 13th, 1895, with a Constitution signed by a couple people in this neighborhood. I could take these threads from today to Ryan and Melissa to 1988 to 1895. I could stretch those threads all the way back to the church in Acts, when the Holy Spirit entered the sacred dance of guest and host. Now, this dance doesn't just have to happen in church. I know many of you create sanctuaries and participate in this hosting and guesting in your work as educators, therapists, nurses, artists, volunteers, and just friendly neighbors. Many of you find sanctuary in other spaces as guests, too. And that's wonderful. That's part of forming that ecosystem of sanctuary in our neighborhood and in our city. This can be a vision of our church today, as it's always been, and can be a vision of our church tomorrow. Sanctuary is always being created and being experienced. No sanctuary is spontaneous, especially in our cheap, speed-oriented, comfort-driven society. A sanctuary reflects the servant heart of God, because it takes work, it takes sacrifice, it takes intention. But that intention and sacrifice is what makes the space come alive. When you walk into this room, into this sanctuary, it feels different. It feels alive. And you can feel it when you walk in, even alone, when you look at all the names on our walls, when you hear the echoes of hymns sung 100 times by 100 different voices, when you hear the sharing of so many losses and so many births during our sharing of joys and concerns, this sanctuary is alive with the myriad of ways people have been the hands, eyes, and heart of God for each other. This world is broken. Trouble lies outside those doors. But within this sanctuary, I don't think any power can kill the living God who's lived through the hundreds of lives sitting in these pews, who continue to breathe life into this room today.